She sees this as a microcosm of the world, and she sees how grateful she was for New York. And a lot of this is mirrored in me. That's one of the reasons that I love the city so much. Did not grow up in a very ethnically or religiously diverse area, and I longed for that. And then it was funny how when I moved to New York, I had this sensation for a few years that I didn't know I'd been looking for it until I moved there. And then I realized I've been looking for this my whole life, which is really unusual. And I love that. I love that idea. And I even love the topography of the city. I love nature too. And I love mountains and the ocean. I love the ocean. But the topography, like looking out my window at all these sparkling windows and that there's so many people around, there's this camaraderie that I really like a lot. And there's a beauty to it.
This is Story to Count with Jen Jumba. In conversations with writers, something magical happens. And as readers, we begin to see them as human beings and not just the name on the spine of a book. And my hope is through these conversations, you learn about their craft and them as a person. You'll become like me, fiercely loyal, want to read their current book, entire backlist, any future book, or any book they blurb. And when you see their name, you'll want to support them, not just as incredible storytellers, but also the thoughtful individuals you have come to know. I'm super excited because my guest today is L.A. Chandlar. She is the award-winning author of the Art Deco Mystery Series, which has been nominated for the Agatha, Lefty, Macavity, Silver Falchion, and Anthony Awards. She's a winner of Suspense Magazine's highest award, the Crimson Scribe Book of the Year, as well as the GANYC Apple Award for Outstanding Achievement in Literature. Lori's degrees are in English and PR from the University of Michigan, and she has been living and writing in New York City for 20 years. Lori has been speaking for a variety of audiences for over 25 years, including a women's group with the United Nations. Her talks range from New York City history, the world of Art Deco, the psychology of creativity, and the history of holiday traditions. Lori also has worked in PR for General Motors, writes and fundraises for a global nonprofit, is the mother of 2 boys, and a fierce advocate for women's rights, which you'll see highlighted in this book. And she has toured the nation managing a rock band. She loves coffee and wine and hates thwarted love and raisins. So her latest book in the Lane series is The Hindenburg Spy. Super excited to talk to you about this book. So can you start and kind of just give us what everybody calls the elevator pitch or a brief introduction to this story?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks so much for having me. This is just an absolute treat. So I really appreciate it. The Hindenburg Spy is the 4th installment of the Lane Sanders mysteries. She is a protagonist who's the aide to one of New York's famous 1930s mayors, Fiorello LaGuardia. And in this one, as the gangs are at war, and which happened after Prohibition, there are threats that are happening and an increase. And she hears the words in a smoky jazz club, Hindenburg hit. And she believes that it's her nemesis and she has to get on the Hindenburg. She's the only one that can thwart this. And it turns out that it's possible that it could even cause a global disaster. So she's on her way.
You talked about her arch nemesis. There's also humor in this book, which you capture really well. And her arch nemesis is Daphne, to the point where I have to kind of quote something from the book in which she being Lane describes her arch nemesis as mall and mobster mixed with the sleazy Glinda the Good Witch. Don't forget to throw in a dash of insanity, more than a dash. And I just thought her description of her arch nemesis is perfect.
Great.
So,
I have villains who are, I love all characters who are complicated. There are definitely characters who are all black, all white, whatever, but I think the complicated ones are interesting. And that's what Lane has to really figure out. And this one especially is this big cat and mouse chase that between her and Daphne hits a boiling point. And I think she sees her humanity, sometimes. And there's definitely a lot of humor. I felt like that era and these people that I am highlighting in these books really deserve some humor. I like humor anyway, so I don't think I could write a book that didn't use that. And I feel like humor is such a persuasive tool that we have too. But also the era, the 30s has such gosh, there's such a depth to it. There's all this beauty out of adversity and rising out of the ashes of the Depression and whatnot. And humor was such a big part of it. Theodore LaGuardia himself was really funny. And I love a lot of his antics that I share in the books really happened in real life. And so I definitely added that in.
Yeah, it is certainly fun to read, and not to mention in the characters. You also have cameos from people in history. Winston Churchill makes an appearance. You have Josephine Baker in this book, which is fantabulous. Huge fan of hers. Fitzgerald. It is just filled, and you never know who you're going to meet on the page as Lane ends up meeting with these people. So it's obviously a mystery because she hears the words Hindenburg hit, right? And at the same time, there's this capturing of these moments in history through people and events. They're like adjacent to those events to really kind of understand the complexities of human beings.
Yeah. Yeah. And I find that really important. I felt like a lot of times we learn about history in pockets. And so we don't realize what else is going on at the time. And so I find it really important or helpful to me too, to hear who else was around. And all of the people that I feature really could have been in LaGuardia's circles. And so I even have Tolkien in book 3, The Pearl Dagger, when she goes to London and because The Hobbit was coming out the following fall and all these things that I feel like there's such a richness that you get when you realize there's all these people. And I really highlight a lot of people too who weren't necessarily first and foremost in all the history books, especially women. And I love bringing those people to light too.
Right. In your bio, you talk about being a huge supporter of women's rights and the fact that you have Lane as the main protagonist throughout these series, which is fabulous because she's a wonderful character. She's very forward thinking in her approach to things where you kind of think the 1930s women were supposed to be, and I'm using air quotes because we're on a podcast, a little bit more demure and a little bit more laid back. And she's rather bold. I mean, even in her fashion choices where she wants to wear pantsuits. And I say, thank goodness for her because, yeah.
Well, there are a lot of women. That's another reason I wanted to do it. I had an impression of the things that was that too, and there was a lot of demure women, but women were really starting to take off, and there are a lot of really powerful women in the workforce. And so Lane, she definitely highlights like Catherine. Carol Lombard and all these other golden age Hollywood actresses who can definitely wear trouser suits. And so she does too. And I think it's my own personal theory that there were a lot of women doing great things in the piece, even before World War II, where all the Rosie the Riveters came in and we as women helped serve the country in our factories and whatnot when the men were in war. But I think that phase was also before men might have not realized how powerful women could be. And so even I was finding things like Life magazine had their first copy come out in late 1936. And on the cover of it was the photojournalist that got the cover photograph was a woman. And so I kept finding more and more women that were doing amazing things. And again, I just wanted to highlight that because I feel like that's so unknown, at least to me it was. And I find that really inspiring. So.
I would advocate you to write history books because I think we would learn and take a lot more away from them as well as learn things that we didn't know growing up. When I was taking history classes, a lot of these stories weren't told. And so just as you have a main protagonist in the series, you kind of see her character development and her arc of her overall story. I think you're also capturing the women during that time period in history to see them coming to step into who they're supposed to be and what they're supposed to be doing. And it's admirable and it's inspiring all at the same time.
Thanks. I think so too. And I tried to reference weird little things too. I just don't know if we understand how momentous like the 1920s to 30s really were for women. And so Lane's in Central Park in one of the books and she's wearing shorts. And she talks about how like not even 10 or 15 years earlier, women were arrested for wearing things that even just showed their calves when they were swimming, let alone shorts. And that's no time at all. And so even little things like that, I feel like gives you a better feel for the impact of what was happening during that era.
Right. Can you talk a little bit about the Hindenburg and how you chose to make this a big part of the story, where that interest in the Hindenburg came from?
Sure. I have always been interested in it in that I think as a little kid, there's a whole bunch of us that probably got, a lot of National Geographic books on things like the Titanic or the Hindenburg. I had one
Somehow we were drawn to epic disasters, but yes,
natural ones. I remember still reading one on tornadoes all the time. So the Hindenburg was fascinating to me
right.
because I just thought it was an interesting thing. We don't have airships anymore. So I always was kind of fascinated by that. And it was the first big disaster of its kind that was literally caught on newsreel, which was very wild for that to happen. But also, I write all my books in seasons. So I knew this book was going to happen in spring of 37. And that was one of the biggest things going on in the news then, because it happens in May. And so I thought it would be really fun. I always was going to have that be in the book. And then as I was writing more and more and thinking about the series, thinking about the global impact of the Hindenburg and then the conspiracy theories that were around the Hindenburg, the more I was like, I need to put Lane right on it. And even though it was such an epic disaster, more people survived that crash than perish as well. So I thought it'd be really interesting. I knew I could get, if I put people on there was a chance for survival. I had a lot of really fun research figuring out and how big it was. The closest thing we have is like the Goodyear blimp, but the Hindenburg was much, much, much more massive. It's the size of 3 747s in a row. And it's not, we're sort of used to the Hindenburg, being like the blimp where we have this and there's just a little control car on the bottom. And people think that's the only place for people. But in the Hindenburg, there was like a whole layer in the middle, which is where everybody had their own berth, which had 2 beds and a sink in it. They had a dining room, a study. They even had a bar, which is the smoking room. So despite the fact they're surrounded by hydrogen cells, they had a vacuum sealed smoking room bar. So it was really glamorous and high end food and kitchens. They even had a grand piano made out of aluminum. That was on it. And so yeah, it was to find out some of those details that I thought that would be really exciting to share too.
I can remember several years ago reading, I think it's Flight of Dreams.
Mm-hmm.
And that's when I first understood how big it was because, like you, living in Cleveland, the Goodyear blimp is just down the road. And thinking it's just this little control car kind of thing, small cabin underneath. But to realize it was almost as if it were the Titanic up in the air with the grandeur of these, restaurants and the musicians and everybody having their own room.
Hmm.
I was spellbound. And then when you just said, as it mentions in the book, that the equivalent is 3 747s in a row. I mean, that's pretty darn big. And first of all, to think that because of physics that it's able to hover in the air, to me is mind-boggling. And it's in a hydrogen-filled environment, so just one spark and things can go very wrong very quickly. But yet people wanted to be on it, and it cut the travel time back and forth between the United States and Europe down drastically, like almost in half.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Exactly. And I think there was also, I don't know about you, I've been on a hot air balloon ride one time and it was so gentle. And that was unusual too for people. And it was right on the cusp of when airline travel was going to be possible across the continent. And in fact, Pan Am had Clipper service that could make it to England. And so Lane, even in the book, realizes the time is probably short for air travel, like these dirigibles, because speed always wins out over not just the luxury, but the serenity of that kind of travel. And so they got to do, and Lane experiences it, where they get to go up and down. The captain can raise and lower the altitude. And so they could float above all these different European cities and then the southern tip of Greenland and then all the way across the Atlantic and Newfoundland and down. And there's this beauty to it at night and during the day that a lot of people, since it was only about a 48-hour flight, a lot of people wouldn't even go to bed because they didn't want to miss out on a minute of it. It was that special. And she can feel the race of that time period and that industry coming. And so she even wonders how long it would last. I wish it would have lasted longer. I think I don't like the hydrogen part, but I do, I do like the idea of that leisurely travel with that view. We never have a view like that,
Right. There are a couple things that Lane observes, that she could see the curvature of the earth
Mm-hmm.
from that height, as well as be able to see the twinkling of lights of cities beneath, which I thought was fascinating. You throwing in the facts that kind of make it even more real is the fact that there's a spire on the top of the Empire State Building that was actually designed to be a docking mast
Yes.
because they thought that was the future of air travel at
Right.
that point in time. And unfortunately, that did not develop that way.
Right. Yeah, that's thinking, that's what they were. I mean, obviously the wind speeds and all that kind of stuff would make it impossible to do. But yeah, they were definitely thinking outside the box, what we could do, and all those buildings like the Empire State Building and the Chrysler Building that I have in the book, they were all put up really fast and right around the same time. And my favorite thing about it, of why I loved writing about this period, is that they went up after the stock market crash. I always thought they went up in the Roaring 20s era, when you always think of like building and, that inspiring, whatnot. But I love the fact that they're still our favorite buildings in New York City often. And to know that they went up right in the middle of depression, and putting them up is what got us out of the depression, is just really inspirational. I love that.
You talked a little bit about the journey of being on the Hindenburg and the slowness or the not in a rush. And it reminds me of Lane in the book talking about going to Greenwich Village. And she talked about walking through Greenwich Village. And she said, unlike Manhattan, which is, this perfect grid, that Greenwich kind of meandered. And so that she found herself kind of enjoying the journey and looking at things that she might not have otherwise seen, versus being in this dash to get to where you are, to where you need to be. And so kind of that translated back to her walking through the city, throughout the book. So
Yeah, I'm glad you noticed that. I think having lived there for so long helps you feel those nuances that maybe you don't always feel, as a tourist or whatever. And then, although probably really good readers and writers probably would pick up on those nuances, right? Or always looking at kinds of details. But I love that too. I love that there's different parts of the city feel different. And there's these wonderful scents that are always traveling around because of the restaurants, and then the view, and even the different seasons are so different and beautiful because you're walking. I think that's part of it too. I grew up in a car culture just outside Detroit, and I love my hometown, but it's not a walking culture though. And I think when you are walking, you're up close and personal with people and the city. I am outside way more often living in Manhattan than I ever was anywhere else, that depended on a car, which is really interesting. You'd really think that living in the biggest city in America, that you would be inside all the time. And I'm not. I'm outside more often.
yeah, I think anybody who's ever tried to drive in Manhattan would recognize that you can get there faster by walking. And then to your point, I mean, the things that you see and the things that you encounter that you don't when you're in a car, the new little coffee shop that pops up, because one of the things, having been to New York several times, is taking advantage of every single ounce of space to create these wonderful little pockets, whether it's a coffee shop or it's a shop selling paper goods, it's a very thoughtfully eclectic and yet curated thing that demands that you get out and you walk and you experience. So, and you capture that so well in the book that there are times where I felt like I was just kind of riding alongside her or walking alongside her to kind of experience the same thing she's experiencing. You talk about the weather and the crispness of the air because it's spring, and at the same time, there's still some vestiges of winter. So that's really kind of fun as well. Those of us who grew up like you with 4 seasons right now with this polar vortex or whatever the heck it is. So yeah, super cold right now. The other thing that I like that you capture is she's working for LaGuardia, and just how fiercely loyal he is as a leader to be advocating for every single citizen. Not just, he doesn't want handouts. He doesn't want payoffs. He wants to do right by everybody. And that starts very early on in the book, because this opening scene is essentially these 2 street kids that were picked up and put in prison. Do you want to talk a little bit about that as the impetus for the story?
Yeah, for sure. And it's not a spoiler for anybody who's
No,
worried about
it's not.
it. But that really did happen too. I often have little pieces of real crime and real moments where LaGuardia is entering in like that. Often there's a lot of ransacking of places like he does in one where he shakes down the Harlem prison and gets things all in ship shape. tip-top shape. So, yeah, so he finds out that two children were taken instead of to child society. They were taken to Harlem prison. And he was devoted to listening to the police radio all the time. He had one, again, all in real life, in his home, his office, and even his car, which took up a lot of the front seat of his car. Always listening. He loved going to all the fires and the crime scenes and even traffic accidents and stuff. He was always everywhere at once. So really, the journalists had a field day. They were always literally running after him. They couldn't keep up with him. So yeah, he hears these two kids are taken and they're in Harlem prison, which is an adult prison, and they shouldn't be there. So number one, why are their kids there? And then number two, the history books say that I was reading, it was common practice for the police to detain witnesses because such of a high risk of a flight risk, but not children. And so they even had like a $25,000 bail on them as witnesses, which at the time was almost 15 annual salaries. So in children. So he, loses his mind, runs up to Harlem, takes a few different police officers, just like in the book, and then shakes down the place. And he really does find a whole bunch of the inmates that are really just in charge of things. The guards are sleeping, and he finds the kids and he takes them to child society himself. So what I wanted to know, because it's not in a lot of the books that I was reading, is it doesn't say why the kids were taken and what exactly did they witness that was such a high risk of putting them in prison and with such a high bail. So that's the part that I get to write and figure out. So yeah, that's the opening scene, is what really happened, who died, who killed him, and why was this such a big deal?
I think that's the wonderful thing about this book is the different layers of mysteries and things that are happening in the book. So you're seeing like this authentic response to what would happen during that time period, which I loved. And Lane is surrounded by a found family. We learn through the previous books that Daphne killed her parents. And so complete arch nemesis for a reason. So she being Lane, has developed this found family. Can you talk a little bit about Aunt Catherine? And I think it's a great part of the book, this cast of characters, this found family that Lane's with.
Yeah, I was a little, I kind of didn't want to do the same trope of like having somebody's parents die for her to be put in that situation. But the more I wanted her to be, I really did want to involve her parents would naturally be involved in the World War I era, or the Great War at the time. And it just worked out well to have it be this way, because I really wanted her to be in New York, and I really wanted her to have these different, like you said, levels and layers to her history that she was discovering. I wanted her to have a character arc of her own that wasn't just Miss Perfect, but that she had her own weaknesses and her own things she has to overcome. And so that's why I put her in this situation. And then her aunt is, she's an artist, and she is very eclectic and one of my very favorite characters. And she's actually based off of a friend of mine who was an artist in the city as well. And I'd walked to his studio once, and it was really interesting. And I came in the morning, and he was having a morning meeting with a bunch of people. And it was so funny what a wild group of people he had around him. And this was literally what happened. I walked in and looked like there was one guy who was about to go to Wall Street in a three-piece suit, another person who looked like they just came out of the best drag routine of their life, and then another young, like 20-something-year-old kid with like a backpack. And, it was just like, and I was like, they're all earnestly speaking, like, and just talking in depth. And I was like, oh, I love that. So yeah, her aunt is based off of that idea of art brings a lot of people, different kinds of people together. And so she raises Lane with that kind of global, really interesting childhood, because she's friends with both Eleanor Roosevelt and prostitutes. She's friends with Diego Rivera, but also she's friends with like really low artists who are just trying to scrap it out for the first time, and then everybody in between. So I really wanted to that's why I think Lane gels so well with the city too. She sees this as a microcosm of the world, and she sees how grateful she was for New York. And a lot of this is mirrored in me. That's one of the reasons that I love the city so much. Did not grow up in a very ethnically or religiously diverse area, and I longed for that. And then it was funny how when I moved to New York, I had this sensation for a few years that I didn't know I'd been looking for it until I moved there. And then I realized I've been looking for this my whole life, which is really unusual. And I love that. I love that idea. And I even love the topography of the city. I love nature too. And I love mountains and the ocean. I love the ocean. But the topography, like looking out my window at all these sparkling windows and that there's so many people around, there's this camaraderie that I really like a lot. And there's a beauty to it.
You describe Aunt Catherine in the book as a gatherer. She has a background of, being French and part Egyptian and this artistic community. And Lane talks about like when she would walk in the door, she never knew who was going to be at the dinner table. Like Rivera might be hanging out and having dinner, or Eleanor. So to your point, I think it shows that people from a variety of experiences and lives can come together and find something in common, which we have a lot more of that than we do what's different, to work together. And I think Lane's realizing that early on is part of a team. And I'm learning to not just trust myself, which she had to do growing up, but to trust other people. And when you have a group that's diverse like that, everybody kind of complements one another.
Yeah.
Which, you're not stuck with that groupthink mentality or, only seeing things one way, which is a terrific thing.
Mm-hmm.
Especially when you're looking at mysteries, right? People trying to figure out, who did it and why they did it. And, will they be captured? Maybe, maybe not. So.
Right. Yeah, that was a tricky part of this book was to, and I think you can easily see it. And again, not a spoiler, but one of the things that Elaine is working on is that she's forced into a situation where she has to be by herself. It's so funny. Fiction has to be realistic, right? Real life can be random, but fiction has to make sense though. So you can't just pull a rabbit out of a hat. And you have to leave these crumbs that make sense. And I couldn't put 20 people on the Hindenburg. So she had to do it by herself. And that was one of the things that I was kind of struggling with as a writer too. And I was writing this book and I was having a lot of fun with it. And I have all these great, my books are technically mystery thrillers because it's not just whodunit, like clue deduction, but there's often a lot of moments where there's a lot of big high-speed chases and there's car bombs and there's a lot of action scenes to it too. And sometimes you are in the mind of the villain, which is what true thrillers are like. But there was a part of the book as I was writing like the first draft, I was realizing that I was kind of, even in the midst of all of that action I just talked about, I was kind of bored and I was trying to figure out why am I bored? And it was because I love the character so much. And Lane has always had all this back and forth with her characters, her best friend, sleuthing partner, Rourke, who was an investigative reporter, and her Aunt Evelyn, and her, good friends in the office, and of course, LaGuardia and her love interest, Finn. She didn't have anybody. And so I was talking about it with my husband and we were both like, I think I'm bored because I don't have enough of that character interaction. And something really interesting happened. So in all my books, it's told first person narrative, but I've always had a handful of a different point of view change. And sometimes you're in the mind of the villain, sometimes you're in the mind of a different character. So what I decided to do was, first of all, the Hindenburg really did have a radiogram office, so kind of like a telegram.
Mm-hmm.
And so you could send messages. So I decided that I would have her and then the ground crew, Fiorello and Ben and Evelyn, everybody send messages to each other. But on top of that, I decided it'd be really fun to toy with the point of view change between all of them on the ground. And what was so interesting as a writer was I always try to shorten chapters anyway when you're going, especially towards a big scene. And in this one, the readers, we all know what's going to happen. We know there's going to be some kind of crash with the Hindenburg. The reader is more informed than the characters, which is really fun to toy with as well. And so anyway, I start shortening the chapters and you get like Lane and then suddenly you get the ground crew and then suddenly it starts like going back and forth a bit like this. And I felt like it ended up making it not only richer for me with all of my characters in play, because I really do feel like chosen family is such an important part of my writing and what I really love. And also it ended up working for the creative act of writing too, with the plot development and then the pacing, of the chapters and wanting to make you, read faster and faster and hopefully really late at night.
Miss work or dinner. Yes. Got it.
Exactly. Yeah. So I love that. I always tell writers to up and coming writers, especially where you're become a student of yourself, figure out why do you like certain books? What is it that's compelling about certain chapters or events or scenes that just constantly stick with you, or the ending. I really loved The Wishing Game by Meg Schaffer, and I had loved the ending. And there was something about it that was just wholly satisfying about the ending. And I kept analyzing it then. So why am I so happy reading this ending? Just personally, taste wise, she's an excellent writer. But for me, I knew there was something in it for me. And so that actually helped me with this book too, because I knew there were so many events happening and so many things happening to all the characters. The reason that ending of The Wishing Game was satisfying to me personally was that she gave us a moment to do what is sitting in the pocket. Well, I just term it that way
Yeah.
of like, give me a minute. I can appreciate dramatic endings, that have a sharp, ending and
Right.
it's ta-da. But if I'm really invested in the characters, I'm always like, give me a minute. I need another minute. I just need to soak up, what happened. And so anyway, that's how I ended up writing this. I really wanted to give myself, but also the other readers, a chance to just marinate a little bit on everything that had transpired, things that the characters had learned. I
Right.
really feel like these characters offer lessons that all of us need and lessons that I love and have inspired me. And especially the whole idea of the beauty out of ashes and how you can take a whole era that is usually depicted as difficult and hard and gritty, and it is. But also, it was an
Mhm.
era of thriving and incredible art and people standing up for each other. And so that's what I wanted to convey.
Oh, there's so much about that answer and that insight that makes me think about the duality of life and the word and that two things can be true at the same time. Yes, it can be gritty, and at the same time, it produced the Chrysler Building and these wonderful works of art and architecture and music, jazz becoming really big, and performers like
Mm.
Ella Fitzgerald and Josephine Baker, and style, I think, is a wonderful thing. And absolutely in life, that there are moments where, you perfectly capture the and then I think about, because you had written about sitting in the pocket, and I will admit I had to look it up because I think I told you.
Not a writer term, so you wouldn't have.
It's amazing. Some things did come up. I hear sitting in the pocket, and I watch football, so I always think it's the quarterback and how much time he has to find a receiver. But
Kind of that too.
you are correctly right as a writer, and probably as a reader, that I'm not trained in writing. I never want to be, because I never want to be able to be looking at it super critically and wondering, like, well, why did they do that? Or I wouldn't have said that, or that
Mm.
there's a right. But that sitting in the pocket, that opportunity to kind of take a breath or debrief, is such a wonderful gift to readers.
Mhm.
I think partly it works so well in this book because they spend a lot of time as what they call war council, where they all come together to discuss things that are important. And yes, it's thrilling. And even though the Hindenburg is going to blow up in less, I think I learned in the book, less than 60 seconds from that to being on the ground. I mean, that's astounding. And so you have all these big action packed things, these, chase scenes and all of that. And then there's the opportunity to kind of sit and reflect on it, which I think, to your point, is so satisfying. But sometimes it's not until you read something can you say, yeah, that's it. Kind of like when you talked about moving to New York City and you said, this is like what I've been looking for that I didn't know. I think that same thing, it became apparent when I read this, that they have an opportunity to just kind of come back together and check in, make sure they're okay, kind of reflect on things, because I think those who don't learn from history are doomed to repeat it. So that opportunity to take a step back before moving forward
Yeah.
is a terrific gift. So yeah, now I'm a fan. I'm going to be asking writers, are you a sitting in the pocket writer? I'm not going to ask if people are plotters or pantsers anymore. So do you know the ending of your books before you start? Or you're somebody who sketches out?
I'm technically more pantser than plotter, but I do live so, and I really am a fan of timelines. That helps me keep on track a lot. I do love, because I am very character based, I think that is what for me makes me more a pantser in that sometimes I'm writing dialogue or things that happen and the characters surprise me a little bit, or an idea just happens when I'm in the middle of flow, and writing that scene. And I'm like, wait a minute, I should do, ooh, what if that person was really behind something? And I get all those. I want room for that. So every book has been a little different with how I've written it. But most of the time, I have a beginning and a middle and an end. But the end is always a little changeable depending on what happens. But generally the end. And then I start writing scenes. And I love a timeline. And that really helps me see where there's holes too, more than an outline, because I kind of can see what's been revealed, what's not been revealed, and how, oop, there's probably a hole here. Like we didn't know. We went from A, B, C, D, E, F, G, and then we skipped to L. Maybe we need a little more in here. So yeah, I like that. But I definitely, I love the idea of being a student of yourself, of looking at even, I totally understand what you're saying about you don't want to get to the point where you're not enjoying books that you read as much because you know the craft too much. I so understand that. And I try to just read for pure enjoyment. And I actually try hard to turn that part of my brain off. And it's tricky. It's tricky to do. But I also love to then go back and study things. I was writing another modern day book that is more like late 1980s and then present day. So dual timeline. And I really wanted to make sure that it was smooth. And I went back and I had read where the crawdads sing. But what is interesting about that, it was a dual timeline, but it's a moving dual timeline. So it goes from like 1970 to present day, then 71, present 72, and everything keeps happening until they like
collide. Yeah.
I was like, I personally didn't find that a lot of work to read. So I was like, how'd she do that? Like, how did she make it more seamless? So I studied it and it was really helpful because I was noticing all these little things that she would do that would, as a reader, you're just reading it and enjoying it. And then, but it's a useful tool to be like, how they do that, and then look at it and then help it mirror, what you're trying to do in your writing. And I love that. Even, I just taught a class at LaGuardia High School. I just spoke there for a couple of their creative writing classes, and a lot of them had questions on dialogue, and that is really hard to write good dialogue. So that was one of my pieces of advice: is find dialogue that you enjoy reading and study what they do about it that gels with you, and how you might, when you put yourself in a situation, how would you dialogue? But yeah, I love that.
I think it's great because you also tell this from Lane's perspective, first person. So we get to see inside her head a little bit in her like internal dialogue, as well as the dialogue that she's having with the people that she's, involved with, which is a terrific thing. And then you talked about, because you do offer some alternate points of view chapters. Do you write them? Do you write the book like from beginning to end like that? Or do you kind of write the story and then you think, okay, this is where I'm going to introduce the ground perspective. This is where I'm going to introduce Uncle Louis's perspective?
I technically write usually chronologically, so beginning to end. This one was a little different in that I was nearing the end when I realized something was missing and I needed to figure out that whole character back and forth play. In this case, I did go back and then I would insert chapters where it would make sense. And then I had to really rework everything to make sure it still flowed together nicely. Uncle Louis, though, I had that one planned. I have, again, no spoilers, but I knew I wanted to reveal more about his relationship with Lane and why is this gangster a complicated gangster? And he seems to have ties with her parents. And what was that all about? And what was the root of all of it? And he seems to, and even in other books, seems to care about Lane. And so what is that about? So I knew I had that scene. There's a childhood scene even with him that I'd had that in my head for a while. And I actually wrote that scene when I was writing book 3. And my editor and I decided that needed to be in a different book because it had its own development. And so this was the perfect book for it because he's so highlighted in it. But yeah, so it depends. And if I really pay attention to what I'm really excited about. Like if I have a vision for a scene that I was like, and I'm getting more and more excited about it, I will put my manuscript to the side and I will go write that scene. I am a big believer of paying attention to what is sparking your curiosity or your interest and follow it. If I sometimes don't follow that, I forget why I was excited about it or these little tiny elements or nuances to it. So I'll just go ahead and write it. And then I can always rewrite it later and massage it more or whatever I got to do. But I really try hard to pay attention to that creative curiosity that you're excited to write something and why. Why am I so excited about this? And then get it on the page, you know?
Well, I would say keep up with that process because as a reader, it comes across on the page that I'm curious to know what's going to happen next and turn the page. And oftentimes there are books that we read that are told from multiple points of view, and those are great. Yours is mostly first person with a few interspersed, which adds depth to that character because typically if you're telling something from the first person, you want to tell it so that you look good, right? I mean, we're all human beings, right? Like if I'm going to tell you a story, I'm not going to tell you a story where I look bad or I look like a jerk. But when you introduce that other character's perspective, it adds that depth and that complexity to what that main character, to what who Lane is, which I think is a terrific skill to incorporate in a book.
Hey,
I don't see it as a skill. I just see it as, oh, this is really interesting in this perspective connection to, Lane's parents.
I'm glad. I think that. I always felt like for me, it was like a breather in a minute. And like you said, a different perspective that sees from the outside what's going on. And it was really fun to toy with in the second book, The Gold Pawn.
Hmm.
Lane comes across a classic book that is all about dark and light. And this book really helps her. She has to face the ghosts of her past in that one. So she comes right up and close and personal with her own decisions and some of her own beliefs and how she's made some mistakes and whatnot. And anyway, it's this whole battle between light and dark. But the really fun part to do with that is that classic book that gets in our hands, I
Yeah.
give villain. And there's a couple point of view chapters where the villain is taking a look at it. And oh my gosh, it was so much fun. It was so much fun to toy with it and like, ooh, this whole dark and light thing and what's going to happen. I love that. It's the best part about writing.
Yeah. It is a gift that you all give us as readers, that's for sure. You're talking about writing. How long does it take you to, I mean, I'm sure you have what I think I've heard you all say is your ugly first draft,
Right.
but how long does it take before we see a book in our hands from when you first have that gem of an idea?
It's been different for every book I've written, and it also depends a lot on, I mean, I can write it, but then there's so many other um factors like for, your agent editing it and going back and forth and then pitching it and then if publishers want a different book first or, the order of all of that. But generally speaking, I probably take around 6 months or so if and then to write it fully, and that might not include a lot of revisions, yet. But it depends a little bit too on how big the idea is and how I really want to sink my teeth into it. If I have some ideas, I've shared before about how everybody's creative process is so different. And again, I try to help people know how to pay attention to that. What works for you? Why are you inspired by that? And there have been a couple times I am a big fan of what I call simmering, letting ideas simmer. I love to get my characters in a pickle and I have no idea how I'm going to get them out. And I try to come up with an inventive way. So I just sort of think about it for a couple days while I'm taking a walk or I'm doing laundry or whatever. And somehow, like, a good idea will come about that opens up a whole bunch of new doors that are possibilities for other actions. And I love that. And I did that even with developing books. And sometimes your subconscious is always working too. I always say about why we all get good ideas in the shower or at classes or church or temple where you're relaxed, you're kind of comfortable, and your executive functions are turned off. You're just listening, whatever, or you're just washing your hair. And when that happens, a lot of times your subconscious brings great ideas to the forefront or why you can go to bed with a problem and wake up with a solution. And so that's all part of that creative process too. And so I think all of that works when you're simmering on ideas. So sometimes books go faster if I get a whole bunch of ideas all at once and I try hard to take time and write them all down as fast as I can.
It's fascinating to me to think about that, using that as your creative process. I mean, I call it like noodling on things. And, my best ideas tend to be while I'm drying and straightening my hair or I'm driving. In our family, we would call it windshield time. And all of a sudden, it's like, oh, this makes so much sense. But it speaks to whether it's the flight of the Hindenburg or Lane going through Greenwich Village. If we just slow down,
Hmm.
and stop trying to like overthink, it's amazing what reveals itself,
Yeah, definitely.
and there's no substitute for time. And that's normally what it takes is that time to kind of disconnect from doing and just be.
Hmm.
So
Agree.
yeah, this I'm still marveling at how magnificent the Hindenburg was. The restaurants and they had to have all that food on board to cook and prepare those meals and I marvel at that, and I'm so glad you captured that because I don't think as many people know. I mean, they know that there was a Hindenburg and it was a dirigible and blew up and crashed. And I wonder had it not crashed, would we have seen more of them?
I know, and I wonder about that too. And I wonder, I mean, think with World War II coming up, and dirigibles had a big, they were a big role in World War One, the Great War too. And then I even found I have a character in The Gold Pawn who takes a quick ride on the Hindenburg because it was tooling back and forth across the Atlantic a lot for like over a year, almost a year and a quarter, many, many trips to Brazil and to Lakehurst, New Jersey. So it was not like the Titanic in that it was just one trip and, they crashed.
Mhm.
So that was a surprise for a lot of people. So it was a regular, vision circling around Manhattan. And I don't think people really knew about that. And then I have a couple primary sources too, where I even have all the menu items that I have on there were actual menu items. I even have the names of all the characters that are not my characters that I made up are actual characters and they're real people and they're
What
real.
family? The husband and wife and their
Yep. There's
kids?
Yep, they were all actual members, and the service or the crew members that are mentioned, those are the actual people and what really happened. And yeah, I tried to make it as authentic as I could with all of that, and and again, there's a lot of limitation because you have this huge ship, but it's in the air for a short amount of time,
Uh-huh.
and there's a lot of cat and mouse chasing. There's a lot of limitation on how to make that happen
Right.
realistically, and then again, I'm trying real hard for no spoilers, but as we know, there's a whole lot of conspiracy theories about this ship. And through my research, I can just honestly say that I really feel like my idea in the Hindenburg Spy is probably what really happened.
Yeah, of
Maybe not
course.
with the
Of
character,
course. Yes.
but I'm pretty sure the more I research it, the more I'm like, I think something happened along these lines, which is really fun to look at. Yeah. In fact, I even did more research after the book came out just because then I was interested. And then there were a couple things that happened that I don't even mention in the book because it went to print before I found it. But there really was in real life, there's a threat that gets to one of the Hindenburg captains ahead of time that there is a threat of sabotage for the ship. And then they decided to take off anyway. And then another thing I don't mention in the book, but is in real life that I found out on that same one, is that there was a gun found on the ground and in the remains of the crash. So,
Don't know. Can you talk a little bit about your research process? I mean,
Mhm.
I'm a librarian and you do a nice nod to libraries throughout your books. You even reference Patience and Fortitude and the two lions that are outside NYPL, which is fantastic. My department also has all the microfilm and microfiche.
Mm.
So it is so much fun when a customer will request something. And because it's not indexed, you have to scroll through. And the things that you stumble upon as you're scrolling to find the particular article that the customer wants is fascinating to me. I can remember looking for something and there was here are the specs to be drawn for what NYPL will look like. And we think we'll have lions. To me, it's fascinating. So what does your research like when you're doing stuff to capture that time period, to capture jazz, the Savoy, that whole atmosphere of what that experience was like? Because you're not old enough to have lived 1930s,
Hey,
but yet you capture it so authentically. So
yeah, I do a lot. I love librarians. I love you. I think I managed in most of my books to say something about how librarians rule the world because I really believe you do.
sometimes we try.
They should put you all in charge of everything. It would probably run very smoothly.
Well, I mean, we wouldn't have jobs if it weren't for writers. There would be nothing on our bookshelf. So it's a cool dynamic to have with
It
writers
is.
and
Well,
librarians.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know how we do without you. I love primary sources, of course. I found one of my favorite books is called, and actually Lane reads it, I think in the first book, but it's called New York City of Cities by Hilbert Fultner. And it's really it's like a travel guide, but it's really fat. It's like this big. It's like a big novel. And because the Holbert comes to the city, but he doesn't just do the touristy things. He goes to like one of the police precincts. He goes to night court where Fiorello LaGuardia is actually holding court. And it's written right in, I think, 1937. So it's perfect because it's not with the hindsight of the future, but written right then. And they don't know that World War II is coming necessarily. They can see the writing on the wall, but they haven't lived it. I found a really interesting book. It looks so wild. My husband actually found it for me. But look at this. It's like this cool book from the 1970s. And all the Hindenburg, Graf Zeppelin and Hindenburg. And it's a handbook of airship memorabilia. So they have all these great like old pictures. And then I even found within it, I found an American Airlines boarding pass from 1970, like in the book.
That's fascinating.
So I love it.
We find lots of things in return library books, but they're not always as cool as a boarding pass. I'll just say that.
I love it. Yeah, anyway, so I've got jazz books. My son's actually a master. He's getting his master's in jazz right now. So he was a wealth of information on the jazz world.
Yeah.
I do a lot of I get a lot of magazines. I try to watch as many things on film as I can. Savoy was really fascinating because it was the first integrated dance hall. It held 2,000 people, and it really mattered more about not whether you're wealthy or poor, black, white, Protestant, Catholic. It was all whether you could dance. And so there are more photographs. So once I heard that, I was looking at the photographs, and there's so many great photographs of like all these different color hands holding in hands, and nobody's looking at anything but the footwork. They're all looking down at the fancy footwork, which is fabulous. And so even those little nuances, I love bringing all that in. So yeah, and then I did, I have a really good friend actually who's a Francophile, and so she helped me a lot with the Josephine Baker stuff. And so she put me on to a couple of really great books on Josephine. And so there's a scene that's at Chez Josephine, her big club in Paris. And I have a lot of detail in there that's really fun, sometimes really funny. And it was from actual descriptions of her club, of her dress, of the clothes, of the food, the other performers that were with her. So I tried to, and also almost all of the words that she says to Lane in the dialogue are actually quotes from her over the years. So, tried to make that part of who she really was too.
And I think it was great for Lane to hear those words. I think it reinforced that she was exactly where she was supposed to be, which sometimes we need to hear and we don't always know who we're going to hear that from.
Mm-hmm.
Which I thought was terrific. I also like the fact that you talked about that guide capturing New York in present time. And that's the same thing you do, with this book is you're capturing that time period before people knew that World War II was coming, but we're seeing signs. There's talk about the Nazis in this book. And then you throw in this like little nugget, which is why I love when history is infused with mysteries and thrillers, is you talk about the swastika. That the swastika originally was a symbol of good luck and infinity, and then in some Eastern religions represented the sun.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
And
I didn't know that either. I knew it happened in researching for the book, and that the Germans co-opted the swastika years prior, and they really loved that it was very much about success and winning and luck. And all these swastikas had been found in a big archaeological dig all at once, and then they started showing up on all the German sports teams and all sorts of stuff. It was interesting to take a look at it because we know it as now a symbol of everything that is negative and white supremacist and all the things.
right.
And we knew what evil came out of it, and the millions that were killed from it, and then the wars that were brought about from it. But it didn't start that way. And so it was interesting, very, very interesting. And Hindenburg itself was a big propaganda tool. Even in World War I, you just think about the times are so different now. We have so many sources for online information, communication, and whatnot. did not have all that. They had a lot of radio, and that was about it. So the Hindenburg and other dirigibles like it would go around dropping pamphlets and stuff all and full of that Nazi propaganda. And then also, one of the articles that I'd found was from a journalist who took a ride, and it kind of it's echoed in that ride that I have that happens in the Gold Pond too, where there's another person riding it. And I tried to keep authentic with that article too. Is the journalist is up in this millionaire's ride with the on the Hindenburg, and he's looking below and he's realizing, he even says in the article how just wasn't that long ago that we were running around on the ground trying to dodge the bombs that were being dropped from airships just like this. And it had to be such a wild paradox to be in it and thinking of all those memories and surviving the trenches. And it's just, yeah, perspectives that are unique and stunning when you're looking back on history and trying to get to experience that as an eyewitness, as a reader.
It's a terrific thing. I read a book recently and it was after the war, and it was that perspective of how much destruction is left over, but we never really hear about that in history. You hear like, okay, all these events happened during the war and these buildings were bombed and these lives were lost and that's all sad and tragic. But how it takes a lot of work to kind of build back, as her Pearl Dagger says, to build from the ashes. And I just find that fascinating that that's captured in books, those unique perspectives that we don't normally take the time to stop and think about. There's even a line you talk about how Lane is traveling alone for the first time and she's thinking about the people that are part of her found family back home. And there's this wonderful line about there's something of a wholeness that happens when you get to share an experience with someone dear to you or when you introduce them to a place you love. Thought like, what a great line. And it's true. I mean, we all have friends and family and loved ones. And when you get to share something that you love with them or go somewhere that you enjoy, it's a really unique thing.
It is. I think it's like you enjoy it more when you get to see their enjoyment from it, the surprise, the discovery of it. Yeah, you feel more complete in a way when you're sharing that. I love
Right,
that.
because now somebody understands you a little bit better, or if somebody's introducing it to you, you understand them a little bit better and why that resonates.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah.
And I have to, as we're starting to wrap up, because I would talk to you the whole rest of the day,
Same here.
I have to flag it as one of my favorites. You talked about how arts bring people together, and that was what would happen at the Savoy, that people of all backgrounds didn't matter, you just had to dance. Very similar sentiment when there's a line in this book that says book lovers can be any age, uptown, downtown, different religions, skin colors. Yet when they discover a love of books, they're instantly off and running about their favorite authors and writing down each other's suggestions. And
It's so
it's so true.
true.
It's so true.
I know. And I see this acted out on the subway all the time in the city. I see it all the time. People of like totally disparate backgrounds that are looking at what somebody's reading on it and then entering in a discussion. It's a beautiful thing. And I think that's why art and books are the hope for all of our future. It is what binds people together. And there's these special forces in art that transcend boundaries. And I think can help us heal, help us hope, help us cope with hard times. And yeah, it's a beautiful thing.
Yeah, I saw it played out last night. I went to an author event and the author was signing afterwards. So there was a long line and you were called down in groups. But talking to people in that line that you had not met before, but yet we are all have something in common because of the writer that's there. And then, well, what else are you reading and sharing and talking? And it truly is a great thing. And it continues to happen, which I absolutely love. So thank you all for writing stories so that we have something great to talk about and to be able to meet new people, have new conversations. I even think books give us a bit of a healthy distance to talk about tough things, that you're not sitting across that table from somebody and saying that, that they're way wrong. You're talking about a character in a book. So there's a little bit more of a healthy distance to talk about tough stuff. It's a really great thing.
It is.
Yeah. So as we wrap up, stories end. Final 5 questions. Do you like puzzles?
I do.
Crossword, jigsaw, Sudoku, Wordle.
I like jigsaw puzzles the best. I used to also like crossword puzzles a lot more. And I love and search a word. Search a word probably even more than crossword. But I like jigsaw puzzles a lot. I think the tactile things I love fitting in. Yeah, fitting in the puzzles.
Yeah, I agree. An audiobook and a cup of tea and a jigsaw puzzle, and it's a terrific thing. What is one thing from this time period, you're writing 1937 in this book or late 1930s, that you wish still existed today?
Oh, gosh, there's so many. Honestly, I think the Savoy would be a great one that still existed. That had closed and was torn down years ago. There's a lot of buildings like that. Oh gosh, Penn Station. I really wish Penn Station was still there, but they tore that down to put Madison Square Arena there. And it used to be known as the most beautiful train station in the world. It was very similar to the grandeur of Grand Central Station. And to think that they tore that down, it could never be made again. So I think I would love that. I'd love to see it. Yeah.
The library that I work in is 100 years old, and there's just something special about thinking about how it was built. And no wood was used in the original construction because it was the start of the Industrial Revolution. And at that point, libraries only had paper as part of their collection, books, newspapers, magazines, publications. So they thought if a fire were to break out, it would self-contain using metal and stonework and plaster.
Wow.
Fascinating.
It is. It is fascinating.
So on Lane's pearl dagger are the words beauty from the ashes. What would be etched on yours?
Probably that, because I feel like, especially the last several years, are some of the hardest in my life, from COVIDs, from some personal things that were happening that were the most difficult of my life, which is saying something. And I feel like art actually did bring me through those times. And I feel like there is a beauty in that. And I do believe deeply in that reading and art is what will help your soul and your heart heal in ways that other things cannot. And so I think I would have that. I mean, it's funny because I gave that to Lane a long time ago because of the era. And then since my own trials, I really feel strongly about that. So everything that's like Phoenix related, I have like a Phoenix necklace and a Phoenix bracelet because I really love that. And I feel like it is so full of hope for anybody who is going through the difficult times, because difficult times are not just difficult. They're tedious and scary and all the things, depressing, and
And they feel like they're never going to end.
Yeah. And to believe that other people have, gotten through these difficult times and can make something out of it, not ever be thankful for it in a way. Like, I don't like that idea, but the idea of being more true in a truer place now, and maybe in a more beautiful place now. So I do believe that deeply.
I'm happy, not happy that you had trials and tribulations, but that you were able to find the beauty and know that you're more than the bad things that have happened. Who was your first celebrity crush?
Very first was Sean Cassidy. Hands down.
Yeah, mine was Ricky Schroeder. So yeah, totally understand. And then what song would you always include on a road trip playlist?
Gosh, let's see. That's a great one. Well, I really like variety. So that's what's hard for me to pick, but I will always end up going back to having some, goes back to probably being on the road in the late 90s with a rock band, but I'll always go back to a lot of 90s music. I mean, I remember the day when Nirvana Smells Like Teen Spirit hit the air.
Yes.
And all of us were like, what is that? And then my boyfriend at the time, now husband, used to play that at fraternity parties and stuff. And it was like nuts. It was wild. It was so much fun. So I love all of those older bands like that. I love, the Foo Fighters and Red Hot Chili Peppers and all that. And then dancey stuff. I love dancey stuff. So yeah, I'd have to have a little bit of all of that. And then if I'm feeling serenity, then jazz and stuff. But a road trip, I'm trying to stay awake. So
yeah, agreed. A huge thank you to all of you who are listening, and an even bigger thank you to L.A. Chandlar for guiding us back in time to the late 1930s with the fourth book in the Lane Sanders series, The Hindenburg Spy. If this book is new to you, you can happily binge read the previous three and get caught up. To know who else is going to be a guest, go to storytocount.com. This is Story to Count with Jen Jumba.